I'm Prescott Mayor Phil Good, your host for today's segment of Prescott Today. We have a great show today. We're going to be talking with our new fire chief, Chief Holger Dura. Welcome, Chief. Great to have you here.
Yeah, awesome to be here. Thanks for taking the time to talk about the fire department. It's always great.
Well, let's start by giving the listeners and the viewers a little background of yourself. Tell us a little bit about your experience and what attracted you to take this position in the city of Prescott.
Yeah, so I'm in my 28th year of public safety. Started off on a hospital-based ambulance service in Fort Collins, Colorado. And then 5 years into that, I started with the fire department and have been working in a fire service position for the balance of that time. I promoted through the ranks. Probably one of the most influential pieces of my career was early on. I went into a fire prevention position. That really taught me how fire departments fit into the greater context of public service, and it actually shifted. I got a bachelor's degree in biology, and I shifted entirely and got a graduate degree in public administration because I caught, literally, pun intended, on fire about public administration and public policy, and that's something to this day that makes me get out of bed in the morning. So, about 4 months ago, the City of Prescott gave me the amazing opportunity to be here, and I have been absolutely excited ever since. I love this community. My family has already adjusted well to it as well. And I'm excited professionally and personally to be here in this community.
Well, we're very appreciative to have you here, and we're looking forward to your leadership. And we'll talk a little bit more about the challenges you had to face when you first arrived. But I know that you are a big proponent of data-based fire department policy. So can you give us a description of your goals for the department now that you've had a little bit of time to orientate yourself?
Yep. So the City of Prescott budget in general with all departments is outcome-based. And my vision overall is to emphasize that throughout the entire fire department. We're currently undertaking a strategic plan redo, and one of the intended outcomes of that is for us to reshape the way that we communicate to you as the elected official in terms of what the impact is of the investment that the citizen makes. It's, I think, very easy for folks to get lost in finding solutions to problems before you, A, size them up, and B, had a great conversation around what you want the outcome to be. Because I think that derails the conversation either into a cost conversation or into a sky is falling conversation, and neither of those are impactful, I think, at the end of the day. So what I'm looking at doing is figuring out a way for us to have a continuous metric-based conversation with our elected officials, with our community, with our fire department around where we're at, where we're trying to go, what that gap is, and how we can continue to move that. Because none of this is static. As you're well aware in your position, we're not the only department that has that issue, and we need to make sure that we've got a really good set of data values that we can use to propel the organization forward on behalf of the citizen.
Well, that's a real challenge when we're dealing with annual fiscal budgets. That's one component. But being able to make capital investments and plan for multiple years of future growth and response time and staffing and all the expensive equipment that's needed to make a fire department, fire station functional is a challenge that can't be usually handled within a year.
Absolutely.
Right? So I know that the fire department recently received an accreditation status. Can you describe the benefits and the expectations with that accreditation that will help the fire department perform?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think for the viewers especially, the best way to put this is we are doing what we say we're doing. So instead of just taking it by face value and simply trusting us, it is to verify and validate what we are doing both meets industry best practice, but also makes us continuously improve. And it's through that metric lens that we were just talking about to make sure we balance our revenues, balance our resources with the realities and the expectations of the community, and making sure that those meet industry best practices. That's really the best way to describe accreditation. It gives us a framework through 252 what are called performance indicators, which are statements of industry best practice, that we're constantly moving towards getting better and better and better in that. Now, The good news is we're already very good. We're already very good at meeting a lot of those performance indicators, but it's not just resting on those laurels. It's making sure that we have a plan in place that either maintains that level of performance or adapts it to future changes in the environment.
And not every fire department is accredited. It's, I think, I wouldn't call it rare, but it's not common for every fire department to meet these accreditation standards, correct?
We're one of only about 350 in the country right now that can say, actually worldwide, because there's industrial departments and Army Department of Defense installations worldwide that apply for accreditation as well. So we are in a very rare group of fire departments. That's absolutely true.
Well, knowing the requirements to maintain a high level of performance with the current fire department staffing and equipment, we just recently approved a ladder truck that has actually a basket use on the front of it that even has more capability than previous ladder trucks. So describe some of the additional improvements on the truck and the apparatus that you've been able to at least order.
Yes, yeah, that's a great way to put it. So the replacement for that is the sister unit to the one we're actually sitting right next to right now. And it is going to have, as you mentioned, a platform that articulates the last 10 feet of a 100-foot ladder to be able to go either below grade, like let's imagine there's somebody that needs rescue from below a bridge down an embankment, or Whiskey Row, where there's a lot of parapet walls that we are able then to move the bucket down to safely either have folks that are on the roof that need rescue be able to climb onto that platform, or more likely our firefighters being able to operate off that platform on an elevated, in an elevated manner. The real thing I think that's important about that, right? It is a significant capital expense on our taxpayers, but we are able to meet the risk assessment that's part of the accreditation standard to be able to see that there's a gap that we're able to meet with that expenditure. And I think it's a great example of using accreditation and data as a platform to make sure that when we're buying things and we're making those purchase decisions, they're actually well-founded and not just a wish list.
Right, and the ability to deliver such a substantial vehicle is becoming more and more difficult with the long-term ordering process. I think my understanding is our current ladder truck is going to lose its certification.
Yes.
Just about the time that this new one is supposedly be ready and be delivered, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
So our apparatus folks and our fleet folks were just back in Minnesota for the pre-built conference for this replacement, and we were told at that time that we're looking anywhere between an 18 to a 24-month lead time.
Wow, that's even gone farther out there.
It is. It is. Yeah.
What other types of equipment are you anticipating a need for in the next year or so?
Yep. So we're in the process of upgrading one of our what's called Type 3 wildland trucks. That helps us with some of the structural protection needs here in Prescott. And the good news is that our rolling fleet right now is actually fairly good in terms of shape. However, we're now working on looking at our support vehicles. So when we do command and control, when we send folks on a wildland assignment off district, those are the vehicles that now need to get upgraded. Now, more importantly, I think it's also important for us to look at a good capital replacement plan. I think being reactionary on capital costs, especially with what you just mentioned, that the lead time takes longer, we need to be far better at being proactive rather than saying, we've got this issue now, when we can see that need building for 10, 15 years. Planning for those expenditures in the out years, I think, is also important. So.
Now, I think the council has really brought forward the need for additional fire stations to be able to have really adequate response times to the growing areas of Prescott, North Prescott, et cetera, and additional staffing. And we've even talked about having some of these quick response trucks that don't necessarily need a fully staffed fire truck. Can you respond to those plans.
Yeah, absolutely. So obviously response time is one of the primary deliverables that a fire department is responsible for meeting. However, really back to the outcome conversation, it's making sure that in this all hazards response environment that fire departments operate in, which means emergency medical services, technical rescue, wildland response, hazardous materials, making sure that we have more than just a response time and just a fire station response component to that. And so we're looking at things, for instance, like what you just mentioned, the low acuity responses. Fire departments all across the country are now looking at more indigent care, other issues that really a unit like this was never built or designed for, nor is it the most effective or efficient way of responding to that community need. And so it's identifying that using low acuity responses like a pickup truck where two folks, a paramedic, and maybe even someone like a mental health worker, the police department is currently working on those initiatives, and finding a more appropriate resource to handle that call, keeping one of these units staffed in the station, ready to respond to the emergency need. That's a much more effective and efficient way.
What percentage of emergency calls are actually fire related?
Yeah, that's great. So about 5% overall from the dispatch center. So 95% of what we deliver for the citizens every day doesn't start with a fire.
Any other expectations for expansion? I know we talked about the need for an additional fire station. I think there's a need for more than one. And I know we can't identify the exact location, but maybe you could describe where they're generally going to be needed.
Yeah, I think we really need 2 additional stations in the Watson Lake area as well as in the Embry-Riddle Heritage Park area, and then an additional one somewhere around 89 and Granite Dells. Those are the areas we're generally looking in right now. And one of those stations will be a relocation of an existing station, so the staff doesn't necessarily have to get duplicated. But in order for us to respond to the North Prescott growth and meet that both now and in the future, I think those are the 3 locations in general that we need to look at. And it's in addition to making sure we're being more effective and efficient with low acuity call management, making sure we leverage technology as much as possible, and using community risk reduction to reduce the risk that we're responding to. That's, I think, the best solution for the city.
How much access and how accurate is the data that you're trying to collect to be able to plan for these different facilities, equipment, staffing, et cetera?
Yeah, we have a good foundation and a good baseline, but I think I want to see us utilize more comprehensive data sources that are not just public safety related. So for instance, good, reliable census data, looking at county assessor records, figuring out where our at-risk populations live in those areas so that we can fine-tune that. And that's something that fire departments traditionally have not done. We've just said, hey, we've got this great repository of run data. Well, that's one good data point, but we need to have more data points. And so those are some things that I'm looking at as well to make sure that when we make 50 to 75-year capital decisions, they're in the right place as much as we possibly can bring.
Yeah, I think it's somewhat difficult in the city of Prescott when we have so many homes, second homes, vacation homes, summer homes, that they don't show up on population data because the people who build those homes their primary residence is another part of the state. But regardless, when they come up to visit, they may have the same type of 911 issues that occur that a resident does. So that makes that data a little bit difficult to be able to have a reliable projection for.
Yeah, and I'll give you one example really quickly of how we're starting to think differently in the fire world. So for instance, here in our community, if we have in the assessor record a occupancy, a home, right, that has not had a building permit pulled in over 30 years, but we show it as owner occupied, there's a high likelihood that there's an individual there that might be aging in that home that will increase the demand for service for us. And so identifying those homes ahead of time and using proactive home visit type interventions will help us reduce the emergency call volume. And that's something the fire departments traditionally have not done.
That's true.
So we're really trying to be on the cutting edge of figuring out where the service demand is going to be, to your point.
Yeah, there's another example of being able to have access to some reliable data to decide how to staff, where to staff. what kind of response you may need. Certainly you don't need a fully staffed engine to respond, where one of those lower acuity trucks would be much more appropriate for assessing the need in that area.
Yeah.
Let's talk a little bit about your original relocation. We had the Crooks fire occur. Talk about a trial by fire. You were actually in the process of driving here.
Correct.
When those first major alarms were occurring.
Yeah.
Can you describe that for us? I think it was just kind of a remarkable situation, and it allowed you really to have a firsthand practical experience of some of the wildfire threats and responses that occurred.
Yeah, and the biggest thing that I think we discovered, or I discovered, I should say, was the amazing collaboration between the various response partners, whether it's the Forest Service, the meeting that you and I had with them even during that event, the state, other fire departments, law enforcement partners. It is really, truly here in Prescott that I think we need to communicate this more with our citizens. One governmental entity that comes together with others to solve the problem. And that's not common in other places in the country. And I think we should be so proud of that. And for me, yes, you're absolutely right. It kind of called on my training, which is just like what you just saw there. You know, we're trained to be reactive and understand how to handle those situations on the fly. But I didn't do that, without the help of an incredible team here in the fire department. Even the presentation we were able to give about the Indian fire during that time and having the incident commander come in, that's about relationship and that's about trust, and that takes time to build. We were able to put that on an accelerator, and I'm so glad that the team was there to help me manage that and keep the citizens
Well,
informed.
we had Rocky Hopplinger, who was the incident level 1 commander that took control of the coordinating all the activities of all the fire departments and all the personnel that were assigned to that Crooks fire. And he was extremely complimentary about how all these integrated units, including the city leadership and everyone else that was really so well connected.
Yeah.
So that's his assessment. And from your experience, how did you kind of respond to that awareness?
Yeah, it was simply understanding that the usual barriers that were in place in other places just didn't exist for us. And so there were no egos, there wasn't, none of those usual barriers that sometimes in these big emergencies come up to manage. And it was leveraging those relationships. And it's interesting that you mentioned Mr. Opplinger, because he's even considering post-retirement relocating here.
Oh, really?
So, and it was partially the experience that he had, which I'm looking forward to that, because if he comes through with that, you have my word that I'm going to try to leverage him into our fire department as well in some fashion. But yes, you're absolutely right. It was the recognition of the amazing relationships that were there, understanding, reading that, and simply leaning into it. And it had luckily a great outcome for everyone involved. Unfortunately, some folks lost their home, obviously, outside of our community. But for us, I think it was an incredible opportunity to further strengthen the relationships that we already have.
Well, considering the size and magnitude and the risk profile of that fire, the number of structures lost was really quite minimal. And you were mentioning it was almost exactly at the 20th anniversary of the Indian fire. For the viewers, can you describe a little bit about what your awareness of that Indian fire and the lessons that were learned from it that were kind of applied to even this Crooks fire incident?
Yeah, I think the main lesson from the Indian fire is pre-treatment works. So a lot of the work that had been done on mastication, on making sure that we had good fuel breaks, paid dividends during the Indian fire and made sure that we didn't have any significant structure losses during that event. Now, the other thing is, at the time, there was already wildland urban interface codes that were being implemented and a lot of community risk reduction type thinking, and that was leveraged. And since then, We really, in Prescott, were able to build on that for 20 years, and that also came through again. One of the other things I think that's really important to mention is our relationship with the airport. Having a tanker base so close and being able to have cycle time for our airplanes, to be able to hit that fire the way that they did, that made a huge difference. And I think it also is a great credit to our strategic planning and the way that we regionally interact with that asset that helped us make sure that we were prepared. Having the Forest Service and the tanker base there, that's a luxury that a lot of communities just simply don't have, and we're so fortunate to have that right in our backyard.
Yeah, we're fortunate to have it located here in the city of Prescott, and not only does it help us deal with not only threats but actual incidents throughout the broader northern Arizona area. Having that capability is extremely valuable. And I think we need to constantly remind the community of how important that is, and how important even our residents are in doing their own part in trying to make sure that they mitigate risk around their own homes. I mean, we just heard about that big fire in the giant sequoias in Yosemite, and because they had done fuel reduction around there, it saved those 1,000-year-old trees.
Exactly, yeah. And I think that's such a great point, Mayor, because really the individual homeowner has a responsibility all the way to the federal government. And that's one unique thing about Prescott, is that if all of those components are doing their part, we'll have a good chance of reducing the risk. Now, I say that because I think it's really important for folks to understand, you know, living here comes with a price. And that price sometimes means the responsibility to engage and make sure you're doing your part.
And it comes with an obligation.
That's absolutely correct.
So can you describe what those obligations are pre-incident, during the incident, and then post-incident?
Yeah, so pre-incident, it's making sure that you are educated on FireWise practices. Even if you're not living in a FireWise community, perhaps encourage your HOA or your neighbors to research what that means, join with our partners at the Prescott Area Wildland Urban Interface Commission to implement FireWise practices on your property itself. In terms of during the incident, when we do issue evacuation orders and we start working with the sheriff or our police department to keep you safe, please make sure that you listen to those. Make sure ready, set, go practices are something that you've thought about ahead of time and that you're able to safely evacuate during those incidents.
And enroll in that notification program.
Enroll in those notifications, exactly. And those can be found at the Yavapai County Office of Emergency Management, as well as some of our online resources. Check that, make sure your phone is updated. And then finally, for post-incident, make sure that your insurance is up to date. Make sure that when an incident happens, that you leverage the resources that we provide to help you safely repopulate areas that we've had to evacuate. And if, God forbid, something happened to your property, that you follow the guidelines from your insurance company as well as the governmental partners that are trying to help you rebuild. Those are things that I think are simply commonplace now here, living in Prescott. We can live here in a very great, beautiful environment as long as we're following those guidelines.
And I would encourage any of you that live in a community that has a homeowners association, encourage your HOA leadership to contact the fire department, have one of the officers come out and speak to the preparation that can be done there. I know in my community we've had a large number of new residents just within the last couple of years, and a lot of times they're not really familiar with what is expected of them, and there just is an assumption that somehow the government's going to do all this for them.
Yeah.
So we all have to play our part.
Yeah, and August 3rd, actually, National Night Out is coming up. And we're looking forward to meeting with many of those neighborhoods to have those conversations. It's one of the things that we're really trying to encourage when we have those interactions. But yes, please know that the door to the fire department is open. We're happy to have those and facilitate those conversations.
Well, you mentioned that there's still a lot left to do. What additional access or information could individual homeowners be able to reach out and find out what they can do?
I think the primary piece is not just in wildfire, but I think we need to also talk about expanding that just a little bit. For us here, making sure that your smoke detectors have a battery that gets changed every 6 months. If you own a business, making sure that you're up to date on business safety practices. That includes making sure your exit ways are open. If you have questions about that, contact us. Our community risk reduction folks are always happy to come out and help walk through your business or even walk through your home. That's something that actually here in Prescott has been happening historically since the 40s and 50s. Community risk reduction has always been a part of this fire department, and we're looking forward to helping facilitate that conversation even in the future. If you're living on your own and you may have care needs, make sure that you follow smart things like fall prevention. Make sure that your rugs are taped down. And those are just a few things that we can do. Now, on the global scale, as part of our strategic plan update, I'm planning to propose much more robust community risk reduction measures that help us have those kind of conversations in a very programmatic, outcome-driven way so that our folks have the resources and the ability and the tools to live in this place the way that we have been in a much more safe manner. So,
do you have any way of determining whether you think there's adequate connection and requests for this information to be provided to these different parts of the city?
Yeah, we do track the requests that come in. However, I think a lot of times what I've noticed over my public safety career, folks don't know some of the resources that are available to them through not just the fire department, but police as well in terms of community policing and things of that nature. So it's simply making that phone call. We are, like I said, tracking those requests. And I would say, by and large, we have a fairly active community asking for help. However, we can always do better. And one of those things means that the fire department becomes proactive, reaches out. I'll give you one example of what we're thinking about there. And that is, for some of those new stations that we're looking at, we're right now looking at the concept of having community spaces there, where we can engage and interact with those homeowners, with those residents, and bring them into our fire station in a non-emergent fashion so that we can hopefully increase the use of those resources.
Yeah, I think having some community-related amenities connected with the fire stations or joint force station, maybe even with the police department, then the community is connected to the fire and police officers, and it's an easy way to kind of educate them, and not only them, but even their children or other people that when they visit here, they fall in love with the place and they want to move here. Right. Yeah.
And for us, it's also going to be a really good recruitment tool. Identifying young folks that are looking at a career and having those interactions helps us recruit interested folks into the profession, because a lot of folks may think it's just firefighting, as we talked about today. There's a lot more to this profession, and it's a great opportunity to have an awesome career. So
yeah, I mean, you've got emergency medical components, you've got firefighting, you've got flooding to deal with our monsoons. A lot of people, when they move here, they don't realize the intensity of some of these monsoon rain events. And being able to be properly prepared for that too reduces the impact that the fire department has to respond to, right?
Yep.
Yeah. Well, is there any other issues that you can think of that would mitigate the risk or improve the capacity or performance of the fire department for the community?
Yeah, I think private-public partnerships are another thing that we're really working on right now, whether that means leveraging our contract with our transport provider in a more effective way, or even looking at mental health resources and being able to put those resources in play on an emergency scene. Those are some examples, I think, of how we can do a much better job of being more effective and efficient at reducing that risk. And I'm looking forward to seeing that. I think this is a very unique community where we're able to do that, maybe better than in other places. But I think it's the responsible and the right thing to do.
Well, we have a very dynamic community as far as the number of residents, new residents, replacement residents, visitors. So being able to constantly bring up the issues that our residents and visitors could do to understand how best to stay safe in our community, and maybe even take that knowledge home to them
Yeah,
in other communities in the state.
correct.
Now, I was informed that you were planning on creating a Type 3 Incident Command organization within the fire department here. Can you talk more about that?
Yeah, absolutely. The Type 3 Incident Management Team is, in essence, the management structure around managing a rapidly evolving incident that will outstrip our capacity here locally. And so what we had during the Crooks Fire was a Type 1 Incident Management Team that brought all these functions such as planning, finance, and logistics in here to help us leverage a much more robust response to reduce that risk. A Type 3 Incident Management Team is a little bit lower on the capacity scale, but it helps us in the initial 24 to 48 hours to help coordinate the resources that are coming in during that phase of the incident, which is a very critical component, but then also to be able to hand that off if the incident does not stop from evolving and help us when a Type 1 Incident Management Team comes in. Now, in order for us to get that expertise, it does require us to be engaged at sending some folks in a very limited capacity out of our district to get that and bring that back. We would never send that entire Type 3 Incident Management Team off city limits at the same time for a lot of reasons. But the primary thing I think the viewers need to understand is in order for us to build that capacity and that expertise, we would be lending the same help that we rely on when a Type 1 team comes here to send 1 or 2 or 3 folks in those capacities. Now, those capacities, I think it's also very important to understand, are not direct firefighting activities. They are managing firefighters from other areas in the country to make sure that that coordination is there. And so that would be the same case for us here locally, is those Type 3 incident commanders would simply be managing things like the planning, logistics, and finance functions for those firefighters that come from elsewhere to help us fight that fire.
Yeah, the more practical firsthand experience that they may have working with an incident like that, they can bring back and utilize it should an incident occur here, and not necessarily make a mistake that could be almost natural without that experience.
Absolutely.
Right?
Absolutely. Obviously, we're still, as a community and as a department, recovering from the loss of our 19 hotshots. And that really always comes back into a conversation of what's the right response, particularly to the wildfire risk in our community. And I'm of the opinion that having management around the resources that we have to rely on, because the city of Prescott in and of itself cannot by itself handle one of these larger wildfires. And so we're going to need to have interaction with exactly what happened during the Crooks Fire. Where I think we have a gap and where we can get better is to have folks both in the department as well as in our partners at Yavapai County, police, our public works department, the county public works department, our partners at the Central Arizona Fire and Medical Authority, to be able to stand up a management team that can initially manage the resources, the logistics, the planning, the finance, all of those pieces while we wait for a larger federal response to come in. It's about those first 24 to 48 hours that makes such a huge difference in making sure those incidents stay small and are manageable. And that's one of my visions, is making sure that we develop that incident management capability to help us manage those, not just wildfires, but also flooding events and other all-hazards disasters.
Yeah, response time, a rapid response, and being able to put the right resources on the incident quickly can make a dramatic difference.
Yes.
So being able to identify where we may have duplication, overlap of resources, and then where are the gaps and how can those gaps be filled in a economical and effective way is a big challenge, isn't it?
It is. Yeah. And I think this is one approach that we can do that responsibly.
So can you say anything more about the vision you have for the department now that you've got a few months of orientation here?
Yeah, absolutely. So we've talked about relationships and people, right? And I always say this when I'm given the opportunity to talk about our departments, to talk about our people. Our people are incredible. We have the absolute fortune to have a fire department that's mainly staffed by hometown firefighters, taking care of their hometown. Very dedicated and very passionate folks. But one of the visions that I would say that goes right along with that workforce is to make sure that they're adequately supported. And it's not just in terms of having more firefighters in the street. We need to make sure that our department has the support framework, whether that's administrative staffing, whether that's leveraging those public-private partnerships, whether that means we're connected into other city departments, to be able to support those folks to continue to deliver that excellent service, right? And that does take a little bit of planning. That takes a lot of work in terms of articulating needs that don't necessarily involve a big red fire truck all the time. And it's building those relationships. And I think that's the last thing I'll focus on there is, it's my vision to make sure that I, as a fire chief, am visible to the residents, visible to other department directors, visible to the elected officials, and also visible with the other governmental partners that we're talking about, so that those relationships are there when not just we have to rely on them as a city of Prescott, but that we as a city of Prescott can also return that favor when it's appropriate for us to do so.
Well, that's kind of describing the benefits of regionalization, regional planning. I know we talked about the Crooks Fire welcoming you to Prescott, but you were leaving an area in Boulder that had this Marshall Fire up there that had developed so rapidly and in such a destructive manner, primarily generated from some incident or location that was kind of an open space around this almost a bedroom community.
Yeah.
So what lessons can you learn from that and apply to Prescott?
Yeah, I think the primary lesson that we learned during that event was that it didn't happen where we had planned the entire time for that event to happen, right? It was the beautiful backdrop of the city of Boulder where everybody thought that the event was going to occur. And to your point, it happened a little bit outside of that and then burned into a community that we had planned for globally, but not in terms of the evacuation planning that we had paid attention to for the rest of the city. And I think for us, that's also important. We have the wildland interface, the things that we always think about is in the bowl and in the basin. But the city of Prescott and the region has risks, even in wildfire, that even communicate into Prescott Valley, up Williamson Valley Road, into the Chino area, Mayor, Dewey. And we have a responsibility as a city, even though it's not directly in our city limits, to make sure that we're able to lend aid and have that planning and that emergency planning, evacuation planning extend into those areas. Because the fire, it's not going to care where the city limits start and stop. It's not going to care. It is going to go right where it wants to go. And we need to make sure that that planning is ready to do that. And that involves pre-planning, communication, and good partnerships at the end.
Yeah, I think we've recently made some improvements in our Prescott Regional Communications Center and being able to coordinate and triage some of these calls so that we can reduce the time for response at the front end, right? Well, we've covered a lot of information here today, Chief. Is there any additional information you'd like to wrap up this Prescott Today episode and communicate to the listeners and the viewers?
Yeah, absolutely. The doors to the Prescott Fire Department are open. I think that's the primary thing I want to communicate, whether that means accessibility to me if residents have a concern they want to talk about, or just interacting with our firefighters that are stationed. We welcome them to come in. We want to have that dialogue and that interaction. We want to tell them about the great services that we deliver. In order for us to do that, knock on our doors, come to our stations, invite us to your events. We're always happy to come and participate.
And I would encourage the viewers to make sure that you let your local firefighters know how much they're appreciated. That makes a big difference for really all of your staff and your firefighters, and even our police officers know how much our community supports them. It allows us to retain firefighters, and the more experience they have with some of the unique characteristics of our area means that we're even going to be more safe. Yes. So I think that's going to be all for our show today. I want to thank you very much for taking the time and effort to join me on this Prescott Today episode. I'm just so pleased to have you leading our firefighters and our fire department now and in the future. And I'll thank you all for watching, and we'll look forward to seeing you at the next episode of Prescott Today.
Thank you.
Thanks, Chief.
Appreciate it.
Yeah.